Hello? Yep. Hello? All right. There we go. Dan Cornell, and this is Josh Sokol. And we're going to be talking about the magic of symbiotic security. I'm Dan Cornell. I'm the founder and CTO of Denim Group, and I'm a software developer by background, originally in Java, and spent some time in .NET. But now I spend most of my time looking at how software developers can impact the security of organizations they work with. And I'm the OWASP San Antonio chapter lead, and I work with the OWASP Global Membership Committee.
I'm Josh Sokol. I'm the Information Security Program Owner at National Instruments. I'm going to probably talk a little bit about some other companies in the talk. I want to say up front that I am not advocating for or against any of the companies that I talk about. They're merely examples of stuff. I'm also the chair of the OWASP Global Chapters Committee, and I'm the co-chair of OWASP AppSec USA 2012, happening in Austin, Texas. So if any of you guys are into application security, network security, whatever, we got a whole lot of cool stuff going on in Austin at the end of October. So check it out at appsecusa.org. Clicky, clicky. Oh, all right. So the kind of premise of this talk is based on something that I encountered a couple years back. I had my management come to me and they said, hey, we need to purchase a new IPS system. And they basically said, our business requirements are, we need an IPS, you got $50K to do it, and give us the best tool for our money. How many of you guys have been in a similar situation? Not necessarily with IPS, but other tools, right? So the question comes up, how do you know what the best tool for our money is, right? Well, it turns out that there's a lot of different ways to evaluate what the best tool is, right? You can do things like third-party reviews, and I pulled this from SC Magazine a while back, and they basically said, you know, they rated it by stars, right? That's a great way to rate tools for some reason. And so, you know, of course, McAfee came up at the top of the IPS list, and, you know, there's 3 things with 5 stars, so those are obviously the best choices. And then there were a couple others with 4 stars, which means that they're, you know, slightly less better than this. But, you know, it's kind of biased, right? There's somebody there that's looking at that data. You have no idea how they evaluate it. You know, stars really don't tell me anything about the actual product itself. So that's kind of difficult. Then we move on and we can do things like Gartner reports, right? We can look at the industry rankings. And obviously, based on this thing, McAfee stands out. Again, I said I'm going to talk about products. That doesn't mean that I'm advocating for that, right? But on this list, McAfee stands out. But then, you know, you see SourceFire and HP in there, you know, things like that. So, you know, you start to get a different feel. You know, maybe SourceFire is looking a little bit better now because, you know, they're in the top right quadrant of Gartner, right? So then, Dave, you don't need to take pictures. I can give you this slide deck. All right. So then we move on and we can talk about cost, right? You know, management said I have a $50,000 budget. So, you know, what's the lowest cost thing, right? Well, it turns out there's this counter snipe thing that SC had reviewed, and it's $500 a site. Great. You know, I got one site, so I can go ahead and spend $500 and management has $49,500 left over. Maybe they'll give me a pay raise, right? You know, and there's all these other tools, right? So, you know, you start thinking about it and you're like, well, you know, there's all these different ways to select tools. And then you get into things like features, right? So IPS has a whole bunch of different features. You know, I want O-Day, I want inline protection versus, you know, something that's out of band. I want to be able to do custom policies. I want real-time alerting and HA and, you know, all this stuff, right? So there's a whole list of features, and, you know, maybe certain systems have those features and certain systems don't have those features, right? So you start to get this picture that there's so many different ways to look at products and to evaluate products. Well, the basis of this talk is I kind of want you guys to throw out all this stuff. I don't want you to look at products in terms of silos or things like that. I want you to be able to remove that third-party bias. I want you to remove incomplete industry rankings. There's actually, if you look at that Gartner list, there's several products that are considered kind of top in the marketplace that aren't even mentioned in there. Companies like Symbiotic, for example, wasn't even in that Gartner list. Cost, always negotiable, right? Depends on how much volume you're doing, your relationship with that company, how eager they are to get inside. Features, well, it turns out with IPS, features are kind of a commodity. And that's what happens with a lot of these tools. You look at these tools and you're like, well, all 5 of these things have ODE, right? Which one is better ODE? I don't know. They're all kind of the same. So what ends up happening is these tools basically go into a silo. And you have a silo for your firewall stuff, and a silo for your IPS and your Mac. And when you actually go and you look at the products and you evaluate the products, traditionally, you look at within that silo. And my goal for this presentation was to get you guys to break out of that silo. I don't want you to think of tools working in silos. I want you to think about tools and their abilities to get outside those silos and work together. When tools are working in silos, you have things like proprietary protocols. You have platforms that are greedy, and I'll talk about that in a little bit. Sometimes you have duplication of functionality, right? There might be something that firewall does that IPS also does. So, how do we gauge enterprise value? The value of a purchase in the scope of your entire enterprise. And so, this is what the bulk of the talk is about. So let's talk about consumers. A consumer is a device that is able to take in data from other devices, right? So things like event data, things like alerting, SNMP, syslog, right? A consumer is able to pull in all that data and do something useful with that. A lot of times, I start talking about this stuff and people are like, oh, SIM. Yeah, SIM's a great example of this, right? Here's the problem. SIM takes a lot, but it never gives back. It consumes, it gives you some reporting, but it never takes those events, makes some action on it, and gives back to the other devices in your network, right? So that's a greedy platform. It's a parasite, right? So, yeah. So then you have this idea of a provider. Now, a provider is the exact opposite. A provider wants to give stuff. So you have the consumer that wants to take stuff in, and then you have a provider. And some examples of provider capabilities are open APIs. You have open databases where you can pull data straight out of those databases. You have the ability to export data so that you can import it into other tools. That's the idea behind a provider. Now, if you're able to do both consumer and provider capabilities, then you have what's called symbiosis, right? You have the ability for tools to basically interact and leverage each other's strengths. The cool thing here is you, as the consumer, can assemble an arsenal of the best-in-breed tools that work together, right? So you can buy the #1 IPS in the industry. And if it has the ability to be both a consumer and a provider, you can also buy the top firewall. And you can buy the top NAC. And you can have all these devices working together and leverage each other's strengths to be a much better solution for your enterprise. And you end up gaining value outside of those individual silos. The other nice thing here is even small purchases can have a very large impact on your environment. So you can go and buy that $500 IPS because it has the basic signature ability and the basic blocking ability. And if that IPS has the ability to send data off to your firewall to do additional stuff and send data off to some sort of a NAC system and event management and all this other stuff, you gain those abilities and you can have that smaller purchase because you're able to leverage everything else in your enterprise around that. So Symbiotic security is not a piece of hardware or software that you can buy, right? This isn't like, let's go out to symbioticsecurity.com and pay $50 and now I have the Symbiotic security package, right? It's not a ranking system for vendors. We're not saying, well, that vendor is Symbiotic +1A whatever classification, right? And it's certainly not a label that you can slap on your new product. This isn't, new and improved now with Symbiotic security, right? This is a mindset. It's a philosophy. It's how do you evaluate purchases for your environment. It's a concept, right? It's how do I create tools? How do I buy the tools that are going to talk to each other and relate to each other and create an ecosystem where my tools are able to leverage each other's strengths and make up for each other's weaknesses. Lastly, it's a means of making the tools that we invest in more valuable to us. If all of my tools talk to each other, then I can my tools become infinitely more valuable to me. right? Because I'm able to have them leverage each other's strengths. So, beware of pseudo-symbiosis. And what I mean by this is we have a lot of large vendors out there, and I've already named one of them. These vendors have a lot of multiple product offerings. They offer the IPS, they offer the NAC, they offer the firewall, they offer the vulnerability scanning, right? Now, the problem with these vendors is they offer this and they say, yeah, if you buy a McAfee product, these products will talk to each other, right? These products will give you some of these abilities. And when I was doing this evaluation, we had EPO within our enterprise, and so McAfee was like, yeah, you know, we can suck in data from EPO, we can send data for EPO, and that added value, right? Now the interesting thing here is it gives this symbiotic functionality because I am able to kind of interconnect these tools, right? But it's only within that vendor tool set. So if I actually want to be able to do the best in breed approach that I talked about earlier, I can't really do that if I can only do it within the vendor. Because while McAfee was up at number 1 on that list, they're nowhere near that in terms of firewalls, right? So I have to be able to break out of that one vendor thing. True symbiotic security is about being able to handpick your tool set and get them to work together regardless of the brand, right? So let's talk about tools and their classifications. We talked about this problem with data in silos. And so what I tried to do was I tried to look at the different types of data that's out there. And I want to give a nod here to the Austin OWASP study group. I talked a little bit about this with them last week, and they fed me a bunch of ideas into here. So let's talk about reputation data. You can get reputation data from websites, you can get it from certain services and things like that. But if I have reputation data, then I have information about whether I trust the source of an attack, right? If I have attack data, I can tell how I'm being attacked. Vulnerability data, what attacks are my systems vulnerable to? Asset data, what versions of the OS and software am I running? Identity data, who's using my systems? Data classification, who should have access to what? This is all data where if you buy a single tool that does not have these provider and consumer capabilities, this is data that just sits in a silo. It's data that is useful within that silo, but think about if this data were to break out of that silo and your IPS tool was able to have all of this functionality. That becomes infinitely more valuable to us. We can start to establish things like trust hierarchies. We can look at authentication data, authorization data, QA data about what's been tested, what hasn't been, trust boundaries, right? The possibilities are limited only by the tools that you guys already have in your arsenal. And if you're buying a tool and you're able to leverage the ability of the tools that are already in your arsenal, then why wouldn't you want to do that? So magic happens, right? You start asking questions like, should I accept packets from some random IP? Maybe on your local network, maybe on the internet. Well, how do I answer that question? Reputation data, right? Where is that attack coming from? Do I trust that source? Attack data, what is the vulnerability? What's the exploit that they're targeting? Asset data, what asset are they going after? What software packages, what versions of the OS are actually running on that system? Trust boundaries, right? Did it cross from our internet into our intranet? If you're able to break each of these pieces of data out of their silo, meld them together, then you can very easily answer that question. Another question, should I allow random person X to download some file, right? Well, if I start getting data about data classification on my network, and I have the reputation data about where they're coming from, and I know they're authenticated and they're authorized, and I know they haven't crossed a trust boundary, then maybe my answer is yes. Right now, all this data exists in silos. But if we're able to break out of those silos, we're able to piece together that data, and we're able to use it in a much more meaningful form. With symbiotic security, the possibilities are really limited only by the security ecosystem that you've already put in place. You guys all have tools today. Some of those tools have this ability, some of them do not. And the whole idea here is when you're evaluating tools, don't just look at the functionality that's being provided by that tool. Don't look at the price tag. Don't look at the Gartner rankings. Start looking at these abilities of consuming and providing, because you're going to be able to build up a tool set that is that much more valuable to you and your environment. Things like creating WAF rules based on attack data, and Dan will talk about that in a little bit. Is a targeted exploit actually going to affect the system that they're targeting, right? If there's an exploit that's a Windows exploit and it's targeting a Linux system, I can effectively ignore that attack. Should I allow a system on my network, right? All questions that we can answer if we're able to break that data outside of the silos. So, for you guys, demand symbiotic security. When you are talking to vendors, you need to tell them that I am looking for tools that has this type of functionality. I am evaluating you as a vendor based on your ability to work with the tools that I already have in place. And I know you have a certain set of functionality, but if that guy has additional functionality and I'm able to leverage that in other places throughout my environment, then that's of value to me. And so part of this, the reason why we're here, the reason why we're talking to you is as evangelists. We need you guys to pick up the symbiotic security torch and say, yes, I demand this. I want my vendors to do this. I actually had a really interesting conversation last night with the new director of sales for Trusteer. And we started talking about the idea of symbiotic security. And he was like, oh, vendors won't want to do that. And then we got a little bit deeper into the conversation. We started talking about some of their competitors. And we actually found out that some of the functionality of their competitors would actually benefit them directly. That was a really cool realization for him to have. Being able to have data coming from the competitor would actually make my tool more valuable. That's pretty cool. So, other tools in your environment that their tools can consume data from. So if I'm looking at a vendor, are there other tools that I can send data to these guys that'll make that tool more valuable? Are there other tools in my environment that their tool can provide data to? The net increase in security for your entire tool ecosystem, and not just the tool's siloed functionality, right? When you're making this evaluation, you have to look at the big picture, not just within that IPS silo. Maybe. I think we're running out of battery there. All right. So that's a perfect time for me to turn the mic over to Dan to tell you about ThreadFix. And the reason why I asked Dan to come and to join me in this presentation is because I was really looking for a tool that embodied symbiotic security, that got it, that understood the benefits of taking data from one tool and feeding it back to another, and then taking it from that tool and feeding it back into the system. And so Dan's going to tell you about ThreadFix. He's going to show you a demo of the tool. It's a free tool. It's available from the Denim Group. And I hope that you guys will take a look at this. And if you're using any sort of static analysis, dynamic analysis, things for your web applications, seriously consider using this. We use it within our enterprise, and it's fantastic. It really embodies the symbiotic security that I've told you about.
It's my turn now that the clicker doesn't work anymore. So, with that, thanks, Josh. Yeah, so I want to talk about ThreadFix, which is a tool that we put together, kind of independent. But when we started talking to Josh about his concept with the symbiotic security, we found that we were playing like very much in the same sandbox. Ooh, there we go. So just an overview. ThreadFix is a software vulnerability aggregation and management system. And the goal is to help organizations that are doing software assurance activities to, web app pen testing, static code reviews, threat modeling, things like that. Want to be able to move all that, like store all that information about their activities in a single place, and then to allow the folks that are responsible for application security to go reach out to folks in other parts of the organization, to reach out to the folks that are responsible for security operations, and ultimately to reach out to the developers who are the folks that are probably going to have to actually do things to fix these vulnerabilities that were identified. It's freely available. It's under a Mozilla public license, and that's the Google Code site right there. And so, yeah, feel free to check it out. It comes with a download. The betas have just a real easy like unpacking zip. You just like unpack the zip, run the start script, and it fires up the embedded Tomcat server. So it should be real easy just to get started and kind of put it through its paces. And again, we're going to show a couple different parts of this, but basically, as I said before, if you're doing dynamic testing, if you're doing static analysis, if you're doing manual penetration testing, other sorts of activities that you use to identify vulnerabilities in the software you have deployed in your organization, our goal is with ThreadFix is to make it so that you can collect all of that in a single place. And so even, because we run into a lot of organizations and they're using dynamic scanner number 1, right, and they're using static scanner number 2, and they've got a certain way that they do testing. But we also see a lot of organizations, Division 1 may have adopted one organization's testing tool suite, but Division 2 has a different one. Right, and so for the folks that are responsible for like looking at the security across all of these, what ThreadFix gives them the ability to do is to normalize all of this scan and vulnerability data and to look at it across the enterprise in an apples-to-apples way. And so we'll show an example of that, taking the results of 2 different scanners for a single app and merging that together. Once you know that you have vulnerabilities in your environment, obviously you'd like to be able to do something about that. And so if you look at kind of traditional IDS, IPS systems, they have signatures that they're looking for. But those are for known configurations, like known attacks against known configurations. I'm running SSH version whatever on Linux. We know that version's vulnerable. Therefore, I can look for the exploits as they come across the wire for that. The challenge that most organizations have with the custom software that they build is that software runs only in their environment. And so they're not going to be getting signature updates that deal with vulnerabilities identified in their code because nobody, or at least no company, is formally looking for those vulnerabilities. But if you have vulnerability data, especially from the dynamic scanners, you can use that to generate signatures specific to the vulnerabilities in the applications that only exist in your environment. And that's what we'll be demonstrating. Another thing that you can do that we're not going to talk a lot about today, but once you've got all this data together, like ultimately software developers in the organization are probably going to have to make a change to code. And so one of the things that we also do with ThreadFix is we let you package vulnerabilities into software defects. And so we're trying to help address that mismatch between security people that think in terms of vulnerabilities and software developers that think in terms of tasks and bugs and things of that nature. Oh, and I forgot to mention earlier, if anybody has any questions, we have swag. So if you ask a question, you may receive a T-shirt or a purple laptop cover or something. Yes? I am not aware of that. Fantastic. Yeah, could you like track me down later and yeah, yes, try not to hit the thing. IF map. Okay. Okay. TNC, Trusted Network Connect. Okay. Very cool. Come and find me after this. Yeah, excellent. Was there another T-shirt request or question? Yeah. No. All right. Excellent. So. Again, with what Josh was talking about being symbiotic, ThreadFix is set up to be vendor independent. We've got our own data format that we use internally, and we take various different file formats for these different folks, and we can generate that and normalize it back to our format. And that lets us do things like merge different vulnerability scans and stuff like that. So we can consume information from a variety of technologies, static scanners, just some little Gartner acronyms here, static security tools, dynamic security tools, and also we can generate stuff for IPS and IDS and WAF. I'll show 2 demos. One is one is kind of like clicking through the web user interface, which is all well and good, but you can also script all of these interactions via a RESTful API. And so if you want to set up, if you want to automate these processes in your organization, you've got the ability to go in, to manipulate these different things, via the RESTful API. We'll also show how some of these interactions are actually bidirectional, and like with the interaction, we'll show where you find out here's the 100 vulnerabilities that the scanner found. Right, once you feed that data into the web app firewall, you can start to collect the logs from the web app firewall to figure out which of these vulnerabilities are people potentially actually trying to exploit. Let's map that back to our list of vulnerabilities, and then we can potentially prioritize those that are being attacked higher than other ones that maybe haven't been discovered or aren't being exercised. So one of the things that I think needs to happen going forward, and it sounds like the Trusted Computing Group has it figured out, so that's good. But is to figure out, like, what are the different classes of tools that folks have deployed in their environments, and what are the different types of messages that they could potentially send to one another to set up these types of interactions to get more value out of the tools. And so just looking at what ThreadFix does, again, we can pull stuff in from multiple dynamic scanners, from static scanners, as well as from your threat modeling and penetration testing, and those get centralized and deduped here. Once we have that data, we can start to describe what we think attacks look like and send those virtual patch rules over to IDS, IPS, or WAF systems. As over time, we can see where those custom signatures get exercised, and then pull the data back over to see which of these vulnerabilities are people actually trying to exploit. And another really interesting interaction, I was talking with Ryan Barnett from the Mod Security Project, and they've done some work with Mod Security to do passive scanning. And so they can identify certain classes of vulnerabilities just by watching web traffic. And so the WAF, which is traditionally not thought of as a vulnerability detection tool, like certain types of vulnerabilities can be identified by WAFs. And so we can also have the WAF export that vulnerability data and feed that into ThreadFix, so that can be, that can go on the stack of vulnerabilities that need to get addressed. We can also, again, communicate back and forth with defect trackers. And so what we're going to show in this demo is a subset of this, where we'll run two different dynamic scanners against the same site. We feed that data into ThreadFix. It normalizes it and dedupes it. Then we'll generate virtual patch rules for a certain subset of the vulnerabilities and send those over to a mod security sensor. We'll rerun the scan to exercise the sensor, pull the logs off the sensor, feed them back into ThreadFix, and we can see the kind of attack traffic that we've seen. Oop, get back to that. All right, so you log into the system, and what we're going to do is we're going to send two scans in from W3F, the open source web application scanner, and I think we also send one in from Skipfish. Yeah. All right, so we refresh the page, and what you see down here is these are... Nope. Okay, so here we go. Like, from all the vulnerability data that we've consolidated, now we're generating WAF rules. Generate the WAF rules, then we pull the logs back in so we can see all the all the scans, or what the scans had exercised. And then we, oops. This goes a little faster than I thought. All right. There we go. And so, whoop, slow down. There we go. Scroll down. No, is that the end of it? Okay, and so what we can see here is there are vulnerabilities, the way that we consolidate them. We've got a concept of what we think vulnerabilities are. No, there we go. And apparently this was made by Jing. But that basically runs through, from a user interface standpoint, what those different interactions would look like. Let's skip this and go over here. And then what we can also do with Ruby, we've got an XML RPC API, and we can do the same different things here. And so we kick off a W3F scan, we kick off a Skipfish scan. We upload those scans into ThreadFix via the XML RPC API. We pull the rules back out, put those on the mod security sensor, hup it, so that it reloads the rules. And then we can rerun additional scans after that and see how we've managed in an automated way to shrink the obvious vulnerability surface of the web application that we scanned against. And one thing to be clear about, just about the general practice of virtual patching, that's not a panacea, right? Like, that's not going to totally solve your problem. It is possible to go in and bypass these types of rules. But what this virtual patching process can provide is some air cover for development teams that can help to reduce your exposure or increase the amount of effort that is required of different attackers in order to actually exploit the vulnerabilities that you have in your systems.
So you start to get this picture with ThreadFix of these different tools that are now leveraging each other's strengths, right? You have the ability to consume data from the web application dynamic scanner. You have the ability to consume data from these static analysis tools. You have the ability to normalize all that data. You can send the data out to a WAF. You can create rules for all sorts of things, right? So really, ThreadFix has taken all these different pieces that are just kind of sitting out there, and via some of these provider capabilities, they've been able to create what in effect is a better. It makes the tools that you already have in your environment that much more valuable to you. Now, it's probably worth noting that ThreadFix was created to solve a problem that our security tool vendors have created, right? If the security tool vendors had this ability and said, yeah, I realize that if my WAF pulled in data from that scanner and I did this on my own, that would be of benefit to me. So if the security tool vendors, yes?
How would that be a benefit to them? Because one of the things that vendors want to do is have vendor lock-in. And so, you need to have their WAF, but then you also need to have their WAF vulnerability tool, on down that chain.
Yeah. So his question is, how is this really a benefit to the vendor? And that's something that I've personally struggled with, right? How do I communicate to a vendor that Symbiotic security is a meaningful concept that's valuable to you? And so in this particular case, I mean, if you can say, hey, Mr. WAF vendor, right? If you had the ability to consume data from these static analysis tools, that would be of value to you, because now you have information about the vulnerabilities that exist out there. And if Mr. WAF vendor, you had the ability to provide that data about what the attacks are happening back into those tools, back into the defect trackers and things like that, now that's of value to those tools as well. It's not a competition thing between WAFs. In fact, if I'm a WAF vendor and I have this ability, I have the ability to break outside my box, that's actually a benefit to me. I am now able to get beyond those proprietary protocols and things like that, and I'm able to gain the advantage of having these other tools. Yes, sir?
There's a double-edged sword to all of this.
It is.
Wherein, okay, I see vulnerability, I feed vulnerability data into the application firewall, patches vulnerability, great, I'm no longer vulnerable, but the application no longer functions, because what it really patched was the ability of the application to function. And the application had a vulnerability in it, yes, but putting a band-aid on that vulnerability disables the application functionality. There's no testing throughout this process.
Yeah.
The problem with symbiotic relationships is the same problem with IPS systems, is that false positives can create a denial of service attack internally, or even worse, unreviewed patching can hurt over business functionality, causing availability conditions because it was never reviewed. It just happened automatically. So having the air gap between a vulnerability analysis that implies that, okay, I need to QA test how I'm going to fix this, allows that QA testing to happen. If it's just symbiotically feeding back to the system, I remove the QA test from the process. It can't happen anymore.
Yeah, no, okay, so that's a great point. Just if I could summarize, just for folks who might not be able to hear it, the concern there is if you automate the kind of round trip of detecting vulnerabilities where you might have false positives, then sending out virtual patches, you could potentially cause availability concerns with an application by like writing rules that would enforce traffic blocks on those false positives.
Even if it's a legitimate vulnerability, I'm going to run into
Right. No, and that's a great question, and that's a great point. And I guess my response to that would be when I explain what we were trying to do to one of our network pen tester guys, and he's like, "You're not going to like automate that in production, right?" And that's exactly his concern. But there's a couple different things that you can, a couple different ways to look at. Like, firstly, the rules that you generate don't necessarily have to automatically start out as blocking or dropping rules, right? You could put rules in place that would alert and allow you to pull back data, for analysis. In addition, like, via the user interface, you can also script or subject this to some sort of a review process. And based on that data, you could make a determination. We feel comfortable enough that we're not seeing false positives out of this, and we will push it out there. I think the point of looking at this from a symbiotic standpoint is by having these capabilities available, an organization can make decisions that about like, hey, in our environment, we want to script this interaction automatically. Versus if these tools can't speak to one another, you don't even have the option to create those types of interactions. And so I think the point of symbiosis is not that that every process is just like blindly automated and locking things down, which makes for a great demo, but potentially bad policy, right? But the point is that in an environment where you can cause these interactions between tools, you can make a decision for your environment based on risk, what sort of things that you want to set up. And so I think the point is more about getting more value out of each of the tools and systems that you've deployed in your environment as opposed to requiring a specific integration scenario be put in place.
Yeah. So you mentioned false positives, and I also wanted to say that by having symbiotic tools, you are actually able to eliminate a lot of those false positives because you're able to take data that was segmented, that was siloed off, and you're now able to add that back to the equation. So I talked about the reputation data, the attack data, the host-based data about what OS it's running and applications and things like that. You're able to bring all of that data back and use that in order to analyze the problem. So if you have all that data and you see an attack, and I mentioned the Windows attack that's being targeted at a Linux system, a lot of those tools in the silo would alert on that. That would be a false positive. What I'm saying is if you bring in this symbiotic nature, if you're able to pull in all that data and actually make use of analyzing that data, you're actually able to eliminate a lot of those false positives. And what Dan had said, symbiosis doesn't necessarily equal automation. You can definitely have manual steps there. You can have approval pieces and things like that. It's all about enabling communication between the tools. It's about giving us that ability, not necessarily automating that ability. Okay? So vendors, from the vendor perspective, hopefully less proprietary protocols, more APIs. Dan had mentioned ThreadFix actually has its own API, so you can actually get Symbiotic with ThreadFix, and it's not just doing all this stuff within its silo. It branches out as well. More standards, like she had mentioned back there. It sounds like there's a great standard around that. And in general, play nice. Vendors can leverage the abilities of other tools in order to improve their products. Vendors can be experts at the things that they want to be experts at and leave expertise in other areas to the other tool vendors, right?
All right, yeah, and also one other point to make, I think to the question about why would vendors be interested in doing this, I look at it from a slightly different perspective, especially if you're using this for vendor selection. Like saying that you don't want customers to be able to use the data from their tools to help them make better decisions in other areas is quite frankly a customer hostile attitude, right? And I don't like working with vendors that have a customer hostile attitude. And so similar to now on the Windows guys, you can run PHP and other things like that. Even Microsoft has been forced in a lot of ways to open up and to abandon a lot of plans that they had. Yeah. I mean, I think that's something that I think that's a lot of the point is let's look at this from the standpoint of how do we enable our customers to be more successful as opposed to how do we prevent our customers from going elsewhere to be successful. So, So one of the one of the challenges that we have, and it's kind of can you say shitty at B-sides? Kind of a shitty thing that we've had to do in building ThreadFix is we've got to interact with a bunch of different tools, and every time they change their format, we've got to like keep up with the changes that they make to their format. And so common data standards, which again it sounds like the trusted computing folks may have a big chunk of this figured out. Like that would be really handy if these tools had standard ways of interacting and communicating. There's two efforts out there right now. The MITRE guys have SAFES, which is the Software Assurance Findings Expressions Schema. And they've, that's kind of been lumbering along for a while. Basically, what they did is they went to kind of like the top 20 vendors in the software assurance or software security tool space and made a union of all the different stuff that they had in their file formats. Sean Barnum from MITRE he's running around Black Hat. I don't know if he's here, but he's the guy that's kind of heading up SAFES. My concern with SAFES is it's a little unwieldy. Like if you look at their spec, it's a 300-page UML diagram, which is maybe a little heavyweight, just talking about software assurance messages. The OWASP folks also have a data exchange format project. This hasn't really gotten off the ground yet, but they're doing some interesting stuff. So one of the things that we put together is the simple software vulnerability language, and it's a common way to represent, for the interactions that we have in ThreadFix, which are fairly kind of like minimum, like what are the minimum things that we need to know about vulnerabilities in order to enable these types of interactions between systems. Like an advantage that it has is it actually works, like because this very closely models the data format that we have inside of ThreadFix, and ThreadFix imports the static and dynamic scanners. All the major folks as well as manual stuff. So like this actually handles all of the interactions that we've talked about. So I feel good about it. It's not external to ThreadFix. It hasn't been battle tested, but it has been useful for our stuff. I would love to hear feedback from folks, and especially to see how some of the other standards match with this. It's a Google Doc. Feel free to email me if you're interested in it, and I can add you to the list of people that can edit it. And that's what it looks like. It's an XML document. But basically, it looks at if I have vulnerability data, what are the pieces of evidence that I have for that vulnerability exists, and both for code results as well as for dynamic results.
So we've already kind of covered this, but vendors can win too here, right? We can have industry standards for communication. We can have niche products that have enterprise functionality that bridges, that gets outside those silos. We can, as a vendor, optimize our time and our money and maximize it towards our product, towards the thing that we know best. And vendors can excel in the areas that matters most for them. And all that outside of just the ability for you to interact with other tools and gain functionality that you might not otherwise have. Thank you. So some ideas to further the cause. This was actually something that was mentioned at the OWASP group. But Gartner does these evaluations. They look at this stuff on a regular basis. And wouldn't it be cool if we had something like symbiosis, provider and consumer capabilities into Gartner's evaluation? So when you're looking at the tool, not only do you get where it goes in the Magic Quadrant, but also does it have the ability to interact with the other tools in my environment, right? Creating a list of tools with these types of characteristics so that when you go out and you evaluate products, you can say, hey, there's X vendor's WAF. I wonder if this has an API, right? And so if there were some website that you could go to, like symbioticsecurity.com, where you could see this list of tools, right? That would be pretty cool.
If only.
If only. So my hope is that you guys will all join me in terms of evangelizing this, and that you guys will go back to your workplace and you will talk to your coworkers and your friends in the security industry about this idea. And hopefully you all will embrace the concept of symbiotic security and use it when you're evaluating purchases in your environment. So that's it for our talk. It looks like we have one more thing to give away if somebody has a question for us. Yeah? Question? Really? We have, oh, we got even more stuff. How about that? I'm not accepting that question again. There are no repetitive questions.
Virtually patched the rules.
Anybody? All right. All right. So obviously you came in late. We'll forgive that. He asked if there are any cool AppSec conferences coming up in October. And as I already mentioned, AppSec USA being hosted in Austin, Texas, October 23rd through 26th. So hopefully you all will join us for that. Any real questions? Seriously? All right. Cool. Thank you, guys. Yeah. I'm sorry? Best in live?
Crush your enemies, to see them driven before you, and most importantly, to hear the lamentation of their women.